Welcome to a special edition of Conversations Across Time. What is at stake? Indeed, what is at stake for 2020? What is at stake for this election? What you are about to witness is a, a show that will give you some of the sausage making of how we go about doing conversations across time. We have invited members of the ensemble cast, and they are going to explain to you their characters, their motivation for how they portray their characters and have portrayed their characters on Conversations Across Time, and how those characters would feel about what is currently going on. I don't need to tell you that this is the most transformational election that we have experienced thus far, and possibly it can be likened only to the point at which the union was torn in two. So, with that, I'd like to introduce you to our first guest, and that is Mark Hoffman. Of the share with you, share it with. Thank you.
I portrayed Ulysses S. Grant on a couple shows of Conversations Across Time. And Grant's an interesting figure because, as General of the Army of the Potomac and later on a two-term president of the United States, he experienced many of the same issues and many of the same crises that are going on today. And I'm going to explore four of those. One is voting by mail. Of which have potential. Let's talk about voting by mail first. I was commander of the Army of the Potomac, and the election of 1864 was on the horizon between Abraham Lincoln, the Republican candidate, and General McClellan, who was the Democratic candidate. And Lincoln was trailing, and we decided that the Union soldiers should be able to, as was their right, to vote in the election of 1864. And the only way they could vote, since voting was done, was by mail. And the same issue was going on in 1864 that is relevant today. The opposition complained about voter fraud, that there would be too much voter fraud if there was voting by mail, and that the troops would be coerced into voting for Lincoln, so on and so on. And we did have the election. The Union troops voted by mail. Some say that was one of the reasons Lincoln, who was the underdog, believe it or not, was able to win. And of course, that changed history. Who knows what would have happened if George McClellan had won? So we have that as a similarity. And I can say for certainty, my soldiers were not intimidated to vote a certain way, and there was very little, if any, voter fraud. So Mr. Trump can go back to 1864 and look at that. That Grant and it had general and as a just and Abraham Lincoln was a Republican president, and there was a Republican Senate, and Lincoln could have filled the post very easily. He decided not to. He decided to wait for the results of the election. And again, as I said before, Lincoln was trailing in the polls. That's a man of integrity. Contrast that with Mitch McConnell, Lindsey Graham, and Donald J. Trump. The third thing, and this of the white was under the engaged in tax voters as much as they can, because they knew that if the 15th Amendment was enforced, that the whole idea of white supremacy and the Southern way of life was going to change, and then the South would become democratic, and there would be equal representative for all people. So this was the way to suppress voting, and we have semblances of this now. President Trump threatens or at least alludes to the fact that some of his white supremacist groups, like the Proud Boys and the Boogaloo Boys, will go to the polls and intimidate voters. This is a playbook that that Grant knew was wrong and was a violation of the American Constitution. In fact, Grant was in the forefront of passing the Enforcement Acts of 1871 that it was blacks, and this is although with the election 70 today, there was what terms of end close. In fact, there was lectures in the states of Louisiana, Florida, and Mississippi. And what happened was they didn't go to the court as Trump wants to do. They appointed a commission. The commission was supposed to be from members of the House, Senate, and one Supreme Court justice who was supposed to be neutral. And supposed to be 5 Republicans, 5 Democrats, and one neutral member. And what happened basically was the commission Democrat that 185 to 184 in the Electoral College at the time, that the Republicans in Congress and the Republican president would withdraw all the troops from the South. Usher up Jimbo happened. For a third term, he might have been able to prevent the disputed election because he believed he would have won handily, and Reconstruction could have continued, and we would have a different outcome in terms of racial unrest and racial equality in this country. Grant is, and I studied the character completely and in depth. Grant was very, very, very strong on civil rights after he became president. Later on, we're going to talk to somebody to play Lyndon Johnson, but I would say that Grant and Lyndon Johnson were the 2 strongest presidents on civil rights in the history of this country for lots of reasons, not necessarily the best reasons, but the outcome was what really counts. So basically, we have to look at 4 things, and the recurring theme through all of this is voter intimidation, voter suppression. They didn't want the Union troops to vote. They had white supremacist groups trying to intimidate through violence and terror Black people from voting. They had a Supreme Court nomination that Lincoln refused to, and it's all going on today. And what we need to do is vote like our life depends on it, because our life does depend on it. Now, what happened after that? Because it was so consequential, and I said that that the election of 1877 ended Reconstruction and ended the rights of Black people to vote and to have equal protection under the law under the 14th Amendment, and the right to suffrage, male suffrage, under the 15th Amendment. So what happens after 1877, and what happens to the United States? And that is what is causing many of the problems, many of the conflicts, many of the rebellions that are going on today. The fact is that the era of Grant and the election 1877 and the rise of white supremacist group was an attempt on the part of white Americans to maintain white power. And they were upset that they weren't going to maintain it. And that's what is going on today. And what happened in 1877, they won, and the United States and all people lost. And the fact is, that's why this election is important. Because if we do not turn the page and we move in the same direction of the election 1877, we can have an outcome of another 100 years of racial strife and racial inequality. Now, that was Grant, and that was what Grant believed and how Grant acted. And now I'm going to take a role of the historian of conversations across time and trace what happened in the United States as the historian from the aftermath of the election of 1877 and what happened throughout the 19th century, the 20th century, in terms of racial suppression and racial inequality. So now Reconstruction ended. Grant was retired. In fact, Grant became the eighth president of the National Rifle Association. So, he had a wide range of interest. And what happened in the South was the passage of Jim Crow laws. Once the Klan and the white Knights of the White Chameleon and the various other white supremacist groups were able to suppress the black votes, and the white supremacists gained control of the state houses and the state legislatures, they passed a series of laws known as Jim Crow laws. And basically, Jim Crow laws were separate but equal. They also passed a lot of laws that were intended to suppress black voting. In fact, they were passed to deny black voting. Poll taxes, for example, were passed in almost all the southern states where people had to pay to vote. Now, we have an example of that in Florida where the governor said that black felons, not black felons, but all felons, but would have to pay all their fines or they couldn't vote. That's a form of a poll tax, and that's intended to suppress voting in the state of Florida. They also had something called a literacy test. The literacy test was an attempt to make people take a oral test, knowledge of government, and since most people were not knowledgeable and most people were illiterate, people would not pass and therefore they would lose the eligibility to vote. You might say, well, how does that discriminate against black people? That's how they got around the 14th Amendment. They said, no, everyone has to take it except if your father or your grandfather had voted before 1864, which meant that many white people could vote without taking the test, since most of the blacks were enslaved and were not allowed to vote. That was another method of voter discrimination. So this is what's going on in the South, and we had a system of apartheid, racial segregation, Jim Crow, and separate but equal. And it was codified by laws throughout all the southern states, and it was challenged in the Supreme Court in a case called Plessy versus Ferguson. And this ties in with how important the Supreme Court is. In that case, the Supreme Court ruled that it was legal to discriminate as long as they had what so-called equal facilities. So that was the doctrine of separate but equal, that it was okay to have separate water fountains. It was okay to have separate bathrooms. It was okay to have separate schools. It was okay to have separate lunch counters, or if we refuse service to black people. that it was legal and the Supreme Court upheld it. And that's going to last a long time. And we're going to have Justice Marshall, who fought against that and finally won, on later in another show. So basically, this is what was going on. And we had lynchings. We had burning down of affluent black areas in certain cities and certain communities. And things were pretty much the same until World War I, when even though the army was segregated, blacks went over to Europe and fought in World War I for the United States. In fact, John J. Pershing, who was the commander of the United States troops, was nicknamed Blackjack, not because he played Blackjack, because he originally was the commander of the segregated black troops. Anyway, when blacks returned home from the World War I, a lot of them started to wonder what was going on in terms of segregation, since things were better in Europe in most of the countries they saw. And even though the civil rights groups like the NAACP and other groups rose before that, they became more powerful. And to counter that, there was a rebirth of the Klan in the 1920s. And there were large demonstrations, Klan marching down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington in their robes, protesting any type of racial equality. And basically, they won again. And there was no racial justice, and there was nowhere. There were all white juries in courts. People who committed lynching were acquitted all the time. And people don't want to deal with that, but it was as bad as South Africa was at its worst time. So we go through this period, and of course the Depression hurts everyone, but the most impoverished in a depression are also the first hurt and the last to recover. So that also impacted the racial division in this country. And what really started to change was the activism of black leaders and the entry of the United States into World War II. And after the war, when the GIs came home and the contribution of the black troops, even though they were still segregated, was known, and they demanded equal rights, we had a lot more protests and a lot more groups vying to get equal rights for everyone. And the culmination is the start of what we would call the civil rights movement. And one of the things that happened, and even though there was still lots of racial injustice, but one of the things that occurred was the fact that there were lots of lynchings. And when I say lynching does not have to be someone being hung from a tree, although that's a lynching. Lynching can be any type of murder that occurs without a fair trial, without somebody being tried, or for no reason. And I call it the lynching of Emmett Till was one of the turning points in terms of a move toward racial equality. And the brutal attack on a young man, a young black man, shook this country. And since there was better means of communication in the 50s, and since there was an attempt to improve things, so this is a turning point. And I really believe that things started to get better, and we have to keep them moving in the right direction. And where we're at now is where the country was in 1864 to 1877. So I'm going to turn this back to Vivienne, and she's going to introduce another character from the ensemble cast.
Yes, and I'd like us to go now to Mamie Till. And Mamie Till is portrayed by the actress Kemberly Gandy. She was portrayed on the show on Conversations Across Time. All the V fans know that. But let us hear from Mamie Till. Miss Mamie.
My name is Kemberly Gandy, and I have played Mamie Till on several episodes of Conversations Across. I apologize for that. There was a brief interruption. But as I continue, Mamie Till, after she allowed her child to be viewed in his casket to show the horrendous devastation that they had done to his body, was a teaching moment. And from that teaching moment, Mamie Till went on to go to college at Chicago University, and she became a teacher. And in becoming a teacher, she created a group, and this group was called the Emmett Till Players. And what they did was they learned and also performed famous speeches by civil rights leaders. And coming back into why we need to vote, these speeches were done by civil rights leaders that were, I want to say, fighting for the rights of minorities, fighting for the rights of underprivileged and underclass individuals. And when we think about, the things that were done to my child, I did a tour with the NAACP, or actually Mamie did a tour with the NAACP to give speeches so that the world would understand that what happened to her baby was something that needed to be shown. And the gentleman, Roy Bryant, who was actually one of the murderers of her child, she listened to him do a conversation regarding her baby and how her child had destroyed his life. And his statement was, why can he just not die? He's dead. And that was devastating to me. And then to find out, years later, that his wife, Carolyn Bryant, admitted that she lied. And Mamie Till's son lost his life over a lie. And those are things that we have to look at. And these are reasons why we have to vote. Because the administration right now is currently in disarray. And in order for us to speak as a unit, as one, we definitely have to speak by our vote. And I'm going to pass on to Miss Vivienne Crawford.
So I'm so sorry. I think that you've heard from the mother of the actress that played the mother of Emmett Till. You've heard how significant that her decision was to have an open casket, which showed how her son's body had been mutilated. Is that any different from what we're experiencing now? Is that any different uh, from what is going on now when we talk about Black Lives Matter? When we can see on open TV someone being killed by a police officer, things are not any better, and it is important that you vote. It's important that you participate. I'm going to ask that you uh, come back and join us for